Part of a society governed by unyielding tradition and religious law, Natasha and her illegitimate child, in a Muslim society, unfolds as a sweeping, multi-generational epic of love, resilience, and survival against impossible odds. Drawing from the real-life struggles of a Muslim family, Dr. A. Ahmed crafts a powerful narrative that exposes the hidden costs of honor, the brutality of social stigma, and the courage required to defy both. Through Natasha's journey, from the innocence of youth to the harrowing consequences of forbidden love, this novel confronts the taboos of illegitimacy, gender, and faith. Weaving a story that is as much about the endurance of the human spirit as it is a searing critique of the systems that seek to break it. With unflinching honesty and deep empathy, Ahmed invites readers into a world where every choice is fraught with peril, and where hope must be carved from the hardest stone. At the heart of Dr. A. Ahmed's powerful novel, Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child, in a Muslim society, lies the unforgettable journey of Natasha, a young woman whose life is shaped and scarred by the unforgiving codes of honor, faith, and family in a world that refuses to forgive her existence. Born at the crossroads of cultures, Natasha is thrust into a relentless struggle for survival after a childhood marked by innocence is shattered by betrayal, scandal, and violence. As she navigates the labyrinth of shame, exile, and persecution, Natasha's story becomes one of extraordinary resilience, a quest for dignity and belonging in societies that brand her as an outcast. Through every ordeal, forced migration, social stigma, forbidden love, and the search for truth, Natasha's journey is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, challenging the boundaries of tradition and the meaning of redemption. Her voice, at once vulnerable and defiant, invites readers to witness not only the cost of injustice, but also the enduring hope that can rise from its ashes. In a world where tradition and law conspire to silence and punish, Natasha emerges as a beacon of resilience in Dr. A. Ahmed's searing novel, Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child, in a Muslim society. From her earliest years, Natasha is thrust into a relentless storm of shame, violence, and exile, her very existence a challenge to the codes that govern her family and community. Yet, at every turn, Natasha refuses to be broken. Whether facing the threat of honor killings, the trauma of abandonment, or the crushing weight of social stigma, she endures with a quiet strength that defies the forces arrayed against her. Her journey, marked by loss, survival, and the search for dignity, becomes a testament to the power of the human spirit to rise above even the most harrowing circumstances. Through Natasha's eyes, Ahmed invites us to witness not only the pain of injustice, but the extraordinary courage it takes to hope, to love, and to reclaim one's own story. In the pages of Dr. A. Ahmed's Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child, in a Muslim society, Natasha's journey is defined by moments of extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. One of the most striking examples comes when Natasha, haunted by the violence and betrayal that have shaped her life, chooses to confront her own father, the very man who has caused her unimaginable pain. Knowing the risks, Natasha stands before him, not as a victim, but as a woman determined to reclaim her story and demand recognition of the truth. In a society where silence is often enforced by fear, Natasha's willingness to face her abuser and speak her name is an act of profound bravery. It is in this moment, when she refuses to be erased or shamed, that Natasha's resilience shines brightest, setting the tone for a novel that is as much about survival as it is about the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Here is a summary of the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. This novel traces the harrowing and complex journey of Natasha, a young woman born to a Sudanese father and a Russian mother, as she navigates the unforgiving realities of life in a conservative Muslim society. Natasha's life is marked by trauma from an early age. As a teenager, she is deceived and impregnated by an older neighbor, leading her family into a crisis where honor, shame, and survival collide. Rather than resort to violence or abandonment, her parents help her deliver the child in a Christian orphanage, but the stigma of illegitimacy haunts Natasha and her family for years. The story unfolds across continents and generations, exposing the brutal consequences of rigid social codes, honor killings, forced exile, and the criminalization of adoption and abortion. Natasha's resilience is tested repeatedly. She survives social ostracism, repeated abuse, and the threat of death, while her family is torn apart by violence and scandal. The narrative follows her as she flees Sudan, seeks refuge in Ethiopia and Canada, and attempts to rebuild her life, only to face new challenges of identity, belonging, and betrayal. As Natasha's journey continues, the novel explores themes of gender, faith, and justice, highlighting the suffering imposed by patriarchal and religious systems. The story becomes even more tragic and complex as Natasha unwittingly marries her own brother, both children of the same mother, separated at birth by the circumstances of illegitimacy and social taboo. This revelation, along with the trauma of rape by her own father and the subsequent birth of another child, leads to a devastating unraveling of Natasha's life and mental health. Throughout, Natasha's courage and determination to seek truth and dignity shine through, even as she is battered by forces beyond her control. The novel ultimately serves as a powerful critique of the social and religious structures that perpetuate cycles of violence, shame, and silence, while also bearing witness to the extraordinary resilience of those who refuse to be broken by them. Here are the main themes of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Resilience and survival. Natasha's journey is a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and resist, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Despite repeated trauma, social ostracism, and violence, Natasha continually finds the strength to survive, adapt, and seek dignity for herself and her children. 2. Honor, shame, and social stigma. The novel explores how concepts of family honor and shame, especially regarding women's sexuality, shape the lives of individuals and families in conservative Muslim societies. The consequences of illegitimacy, premarital pregnancy, and social scandal are depicted as devastating and far-reaching, often resulting in violence, exile, or lifelong ostracism. 3. Patriarchy and gender oppression. A central theme is the systemic oppression of women under patriarchal and religious laws. The narrative exposes practices such as honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and the criminalization of abortion and adoption, highlighting how these customs perpetuate cycles of abuse and silence. 4. Religion, law, and justice. The story critically examines the intersection of religious doctrine, particularly Islamic Sharia law, and legal systems, showing how they can be used to justify or perpetuate injustice, especially against women and children. The novel contrasts these systems with secular and humanitarian values, questioning the legitimacy of laws that punish rather than protect. 5. Identity, belonging, and exile. Natasha's struggle is also one of identity, caught between cultures, religions, and nations. The novel explores the pain of exile, the search for belonging, and the complexities of being othered both at home and abroad, especially for those born outside the bounds of social acceptance. 6. Family, betrayal, and forgiveness. Family relationships in the novel are fraught with betrayal, abandonment, and violence, but also moments of sacrifice and love. The story interrogates what it means to be a parent, child, or sibling when blood ties are complicated by social taboos and secrets. 7. Truth, silence, and the power of voice. A recurring theme is the struggle to speak the truth in societies that demand silence. Natasha's journey is marked by her attempts to reclaim her story, confront her abusers, and break the cycle of secrecy and shame that has haunted her family for generations. 8. Critique of social and religious structures. Ultimately, The novel is a powerful critique of the social, cultural, and religious structures that perpetuate injustice, violence, and silence. It calls for reform, compassion, and the recognition of universal human rights, especially for women and children. Based on the content of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, several characters actively challenge the stigma imposed by their society, particularly around issues of illegitimacy, gender, and religious identity. Here's how key characters confront and resist stigma throughout the novel. 1. Natasha. Natasha is the central figure in challenging stigma. Despite being labeled as an illegitimate child and later as a fallen woman due to her pregnancies outside of marriage, she refuses to accept the shame imposed on her by her community. Natasha's acts of resistance include refusing to be silenced. She confronts her abusers, including her father and the men who wronged her, and later speaks out about her experiences, even when it puts her at risk. Seeking education and truth, Natasha pursues higher education, specializing in religious studies and women's rights, using knowledge as a tool to question and expose the injustices she and others have suffered. Reclaiming her story. Rather than allowing herself to be defined by the labels of bastard, adulteress, or victim, Natasha insists on her own dignity and humanity, ultimately sharing her story to advocate for change. 2. Natasha's parents, Sami Shams Aldin and Nadia Alexandrov. Natasha's parents challenge stigma in their own way by refusing to kill or abandon their daughter after her first pregnancy, despite immense pressure from their family and community. Instead, they seek a compassionate solution by helping her deliver the child in a Christian orphanage, defying both social and religious expectations. 3. Wahid/Gurgis Gabriel. As Natasha's brother and later her husband, unbeknownst to both at first, Wahid grows up as an outcast due to his illegitimate birth and ambiguous religious identity. He challenges stigma by refusing to accept society's judgment. Wahid seeks belonging and love, even as he is rejected by both Muslim and Christian communities. Advocating for truth, when the truth about his and Natasha's relationship is revealed, Wahid does not hide from it, but instead uses his story to expose the destructive power of social stigma and advocate for reform. 4. Supporting characters, e.g., Mrs. Mary Morgas, Almaz Abraha. Characters like Mrs. Mary Morgas, who runs the orphanage, and Almaz, Natasha's friend, provide support and compassion in a society that often withholds it. By caring for illegitimate children and standing by Natasha during her crises, they model alternative responses to stigma, ones rooted in empathy and solidarity rather than judgment. In summary, the characters in this novel challenge stigma by refusing to internalize shame, by seeking truth and justice, by supporting one another, and by publicly confronting the systems and beliefs that perpetuate discrimination. Their acts of courage and solidarity not only help them survive, but also illuminate the possibility of change in even the most rigid societies. Here's a list of the main characters in Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. Main characters. Natasha Shamsaldeen. The protagonist, a young woman of mixed Russian and Sudanese heritage, whose life is shaped by trauma, resilience, and the struggle against social stigma. Sami Shamsaldeen. Natasha's father, a Sudanese man who becomes an atheist and communist, and faces the challenges of protecting his daughter in a conservative society. Nadia Alexandrov. Nadia/Natasha's mother. Natasha's Russian mother, who converts to Islam in name only, and whose love and sacrifice are central to Natasha's early life.
Yasser Saif al-Dawla Yasser Saif al-Dan.
Natasha's abuser and biological father of her children, a complex antagonist whose actions drive much of the novel's conflict. Gurgis Gabriel/Wahid Muhammad Ahmed. Natasha's firstborn son, raised in an orphanage, later becomes her husband, unbeknownst to both at first, and is a central figure in the novel's exploration of identity and stigma. Mrs. Mary Morgas, the Christian orphanage caretaker who raises Gergis Gabriel and provides a compassionate alternative to the harshness of society. Badria, Daria, and Maria, Yasser's wives, each representing different facets of Sudanese and African society, and whose stories intersect with Natasha's. Almaz Abraha, Natasha's close Ethiopian friend in Canada, who supports her during her most difficult times. These are the principal characters whose lives and choices drive the narrative and embody the novel's central themes of resilience, stigma, and the search for dignity. Nadia Alexandrov, Natasha's mother, embodies the struggle of a woman caught between cultures, faiths, and the demands of family honor. Born and raised in Russia as an Orthodox Christian, Nadia rejects her religious upbringing and becomes a communist and an atheist. Her life takes a dramatic turn when she falls in love with Sami Shams al-Din, a Sudanese medical student in Moscow. To marry Sami and appease his Muslim family, Nadia agrees to a nominal conversion to Islam, changing her name to Nadia and participating in a symbolic religious ceremony, though neither she nor Sami are true believers. After their marriage, Nadia gives birth to Natasha while still in Russia. The family's move to Sudan exposes Nadia to a society with strict religious and cultural expectations, especially regarding women's roles and sexuality. She faces pressure from her mother-in-law to have Natasha circumcised, a practice Nadia finds barbaric and refuses to allow, standing firm against the tradition despite social backlash. Nadia's greatest test comes when her teenage daughter Natasha is deceived and impregnated by an older neighbor. In a society where such a scandal can lead to honor killings or lifelong ostracism, Nadia and Sami refuse to abandon or harm their daughter. Instead, they risk everything to protect Natasha, ultimately helping her deliver the child in a Christian orphanage and severing ties to avoid further disgrace. Throughout the ordeal, Nadia's love for her daughter is unwavering. When the family is threatened with violence and forced to flee, Nadia's courage and maternal instinct are on full display. In a climactic moment, when attackers come to kill Natasha for the family's honor, Nadia sacrifices her own life, shielding her daughter from fatal blows and dying in the process. Nadia's journey is one of profound sacrifice, resilience, and defiance. She navigates the complexities of faith, identity, and motherhood in a world that offers her little protection or understanding. Her legacy is the strength and compassion she instills in Natasha, a legacy that echoes throughout the novel as a testament to the power of a mother's love in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yasser Seif al-Dawla, later Yasser Seif al-Din, is one of the central antagonists in the novel, and his background is both complex and deeply troubling. Yasser is introduced as a neighbor to Natasha's family in Sudan, belonging to a high-status Arab tribe. From a young age, he is depicted as a notorious womanizer, driven by lust and a disregard for the emotional and social consequences of his actions. Despite being married, first in an arranged marriage to his cousin Badria, Yasser is never satisfied and continually seeks out other women, often manipulating or coercing them. Yasser's predatory behavior comes to a head when he deceives and impregnates the underage Natasha, setting off a chain of events that devastate multiple families. Rather than taking responsibility, Yasser flees when faced with the threat of honor violence from Natasha's relatives. His life is marked by a pattern of exploitation, polygamy, and evasion of accountability. Over time, he accumulates multiple wives, Muslim and Christian, using marriage as a means of control and material gain, and fathers children with several women, often abandoning them. After fleeing Sudan, Yasser's journey takes him through Egypt and eventually to Canada, where he seeks refugee status by presenting himself as a victim of honor violence. In Canada, he continues his pattern of manipulation, exploiting the welfare system, engaging in further sexual predation, including targeting underage girls, and becoming embroiled in criminal activity. His actions lead to multiple legal and social crises, including charges of sexual assault and child abuse. Yasser's character is also shaped by his relationship to religion and power. While he uses Islamic law and rhetoric to justify his actions and maintain authority, he is portrayed as deeply hypocritical, using religion as a tool for self-interest rather than genuine faith. Later in the novel, after a period of imprisonment, Yasser reinvents himself as a devout Muslim leader, gaining influence within immigrant communities and even orchestrating terrorist plots. His transformation from a sexual predator to a religious figure and then to a terrorist mastermind underscores the dangers of unchecked power, misogyny, and the manipulation of faith for personal gain. Ultimately, Yasser's background is a study in the destructive potential of patriarchal authority, religious hypocrisy, and the cycles of violence and abuse that can be perpetuated by individuals who exploit both people and systems for their own ends. Contact and manipulation. Natasha and Yasser first meet as neighbors in the city of Wad Madani, Sudan. Yasser is significantly older, already married, and known for his predatory behavior. He becomes infatuated with Natasha, who is only 14 years old. Using his proximity and charm, Yasser begins to pursue Natasha, exploiting her innocence and lack of experience. He convinces her that he loves her, manipulates her emotionally, and initiates a secret relationship. Deception and abuse. Yasser's manipulation escalates as he persuades Natasha to engage in a sexual relationship, promising her love and even marriage. He takes advantage of her naivety and the lack of protection from her family, who are unaware of the depth of his intentions. This relationship results in Natasha's pregnancy, which becomes a source of immense shame and crisis for her and her family in their conservative Muslim community. Consequences and fallout. The consequences of their relationship are severe and far-reaching. Natasha's family faces social disgrace and the threat of honor violence. Yasser refuses to take responsibility, fleeing when confronted by Natasha's relatives. Natasha is forced to deliver her child in secrecy at a Christian orphanage, and the child is given away. The scandal leads to repeated cycles of trauma, forced migration, and ongoing threats to Natasha's safety and dignity. Continued exploitation. Even after the initial crisis, Yasser's presence continues to haunt Natasha. He reappears in her life, manipulates situations to his advantage, and is involved in further acts of violence and abuse, including a second pregnancy. Yasser's actions drive much of the novel's conflict, as Natasha and her family are repeatedly forced to flee, hide, and rebuild their lives in the face of his ongoing threats. Transformation and antagonism. Yasser later reinvents himself as a religious leader and, eventually, a terrorist mastermind, using his power and influence to orchestrate further harm against Natasha and others. His relationship with Natasha evolves from one of predatory intimacy to relentless antagonism, as he becomes the embodiment of the patriarchal and religious forces that seek to control and destroy her. In summary, Natasha and Yasser's relationship evolves from neighborly acquaintance to a deeply abusive and destructive dynamic, marked by manipulation, betrayal, and violence. Yasser's actions set off a chain of events that shaped the entire trajectory of Natasha's life, making him the central antagonist in her struggle for survival and dignity. Based on the content of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, Yasser never shows genuine remorse for his actions throughout the novel. Instead, Yasser consistently justifies, denies, or rationalizes his behavior. Manipulation and justification. Yasser repeatedly manipulates those around him, including Natasha, and uses religious or cultural justifications to excuse his predatory and abusive actions. He never sincerely acknowledges the harm he has caused to Natasha or others. Lack of accountability. When confronted with the consequences of his actions, such as Natasha's pregnancies, the destruction of her family, and the violence that follows, Yasser flees, lies, or shifts blame rather than expressing regret or seeking forgiveness. Escalation of harm. Rather than feeling remorse, Yasser's behavior escalates. He continues to exploit, abuse, and endanger others, including orchestrating further violence and even terrorist acts as the story progresses. no redemption arc, even in his later years. After periods of imprisonment and reinvention as a religious leader, Yasser does not reflect on his past with regret. Instead, he uses his experiences to manipulate others and gain power, never demonstrating empathy or sorrow for his victims. In summary, Yasser's character is marked by a complete absence of remorse. He embodies the dangers of unchecked power, misogyny, and religious hypocrisy, and his lack of repentance is central to his role as the novel's antagonist. Based on the content of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, the reactions of others to Yasser's behavior are wide-ranging and deeply significant to the novel's themes. 1. Natasha and her family. Victims of betrayal and trauma, Natasha and her parents are devastated by Yasser's predatory actions. Natasha suffers lifelong trauma, social stigma, and repeated cycles of violence and exile as a direct result of Yasser's abuse and refusal to take responsibility. Protective but powerless, her parents, Sammy and Nadia, try to protect her, but are ultimately overwhelmed by the social and legal consequences Yasser's actions bring upon their family. 2. Sudanese society and extended family. Harsh judgment and violence. The broader community reacts with outrage and violence, not toward Yasser, but toward Natasha and her family. The focus is on family honor, leading to threats of honor killing, ostracism, and relentless gossip. Yasser himself largely escapes direct community punishment by fleeing. Enablers and deniers. Many in the community either ignore Yasser's responsibility or rationalize his actions, focusing instead on punishing the female victim and her family. 3. Yasser's wives and associates. Victims and rivals. Yasser's wives, Badriya, Duriya, Maria, are also victims of his manipulation, neglect, and abuse. They sometimes fight among themselves, but Yasser rarely faces consequences from them directly, as he uses religious and cultural justifications to maintain control. Some seek justice. Occasionally, as with Maria and Duriya, there are confrontations and even legal action, but Yasser often escapes accountability by exploiting legal and social loopholes. 4. Legal and religious authorities. Complicity or ineffectiveness. In Sudan, the legal and religious systems are more likely to punish Natasha and her family than Yasser. Even when his crimes are known, the focus of punishment is on the female victim, not the male perpetrator. International and Western authorities. In Canada, Yasser eventually faces criminal charges for sexual assault and child abuse and is imprisoned. However, even then, his past is sometimes overlooked or rationalized by those who see him as a victim of cultural misunderstanding. 5. The broader community. Polarized reactions. Some in the immigrant and religious communities defend Yasser, seeing him as a victim of Western prejudice or as a religious leader. Others, especially women's rights activists and human rights organizations, are horrified by his actions and campaign for justice and reform. In summary, most characters who are close to Yasser or directly affected by his actions suffer deeply and seek justice or escape. Broader society, both in Sudan and in the diaspora, is often complicit, either by focusing on punishing the female victim, rationalizing Yasser's behavior, or failing to hold him accountable. Only in rare instances, such as through the intervention of Western legal systems or human rights advocates, does Yasser face real consequences, and even then, he often manipulates the system to his advantage. In Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, Natasha's father, Sammy Shams al-Din, reacts to Yasser's actions with a mix of anguish, outrage, and, ultimately, protective determination. Key points of Sammy's reaction. Shock and anguish. When Sammy learns that his underage daughter Natasha has been deceived and impregnated by their neighbor Yasser, he is devastated. The event brings immense shame and crisis to the family, given the strict honor culture of their Sudanese Muslim community. Refusal to commit violence. Unlike many in his extended family and community, Sammy refuses to kill or abandon Natasha, despite intense pressure to do so for the sake of family honor. He rejects the options of honor killing, forced marriage, or abandoning his daughter, and instead seeks a compassionate solution. Protective actions. Sammy and his wife Nadia help Natasha deliver her child in a Christian orphanage, trying to shield her from further harm and scandal. When the scandal continues to haunt the family, Sammy repeatedly moves and makes sacrifices to protect Natasha from both social and physical threats. Conflict with extended family. Sammy faces harsh condemnation from his own father, uncles, and cousins, who accuse him of lacking honor and threaten to take matters into their own hands. He is forced to flee with his family to protect Natasha from being killed by her own relatives. Desperation and grief. The ongoing consequences of Yasser's actions, including repeated threats, violence, and the eventual murder of Sammy's wife Nadia, Natasha's mother, in an honor attack, leaves Sammy heartbroken and traumatized. He is depicted as a man who loves his daughter deeply, but is powerless against the combined forces of tradition, law, and violence. Advocacy and defiance. Despite his suffering, Sammy stands by Natasha, even appealing to courts and international organizations to save her from unjust punishment. He ultimately leaves Sudan, taking his granddaughter with him, and becomes a vocal critic of the systems that destroyed his family. In summary, Sammy Shams al-Din's reaction to Yasser's behavior is one of deep pain, protective love, and moral courage. He stands in stark contrast to the prevailing attitudes of his community, refusing to perpetuate cycles of violence and shame, and instead risking everything to protect his daughter and seek justice. Based on the content of Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, Sammy Shams al-Din, Natasha's father, takes several courageous and compassionate actions to protect his daughter Natasha from the devastating consequences of Yasser's abuse and the harsh, patriarchal society around them. Here's how Sammy protects Natasha. 1. Rejecting honor violence. When Natasha is deceived and impregnated by Yasser, Sammy faces immense pressure from his extended family and community to restore family honor through violence, either by killing Natasha or forcing her into a marriage with her abuser. Sammy refuses to harm his daughter, standing against the deeply ingrained tradition of honor killing. 2. Seeking compassionate solutions. Instead of abandoning or punishing Natasha, Sammy and his wife Nadia help her deliver her child in a Christian orphanage, shielding her from further scandal and physical danger. They make the painful decision to give up the baby to protect Natasha's life and future. 3. Defying social pressure. Sammy withstands condemnation and threats from his own father, uncles, and cousins, who accuse him of lacking honor and threaten to take matters into their own hands. When it becomes clear that Natasha's life is in danger from her own relatives, Sammy chooses to flee with his family. 4. Fleeing for safety. Sammy uproots his entire life, leaving behind his home, work, and possessions to escape with Natasha and Nadia to Khartoum, and later considers emigration to protect Natasha from being killed by her relatives. 5. Supporting Natasha's education and well-being. Despite repeated harassment and scandal following them, Sammy continues to seek safe environments for Natasha, enrolling her in new schools and, when necessary, withdrawing her to protect her from bullying and further trauma. 6. Standing by Natasha in crisis. When Natasha faces a second pregnancy and renewed threats, Sammy again refuses to abandon her. He stands by her side, even as the family is forced to move repeatedly and faces social and legal persecution. 7. Seeking justice and advocacy. Sammy appeals to courts, government officials, and even international organizations to try to save Natasha from unjust punishment under Sharia law. He does everything in his power to prevent her from being flogged or executed for adultery. 8. Ultimate sacrifice and exile. After the murder of his wife Nadia, who dies protecting Natasha during an honor attack, Sammy takes his granddaughter and flees Sudan entirely, seeking refuge in Ethiopia and later Canada. Determined to break the cycle of violence and give Natasha's child a chance at a better life. In summary, Sammy protects Natasha through acts of moral courage, compassion, and sacrifice. He stands against the violence and injustice of his society, risking everything to save his daughter from harm, even when it means losing his home, his family, and his country. His actions are a powerful counterpoint to the forces of tradition and patriarchy that drive much of the novel's conflict. In Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed, the Sharia court punishes Natasha with extreme severity, reflecting the harshness of religious law in her society. How the Sharia court punishes Natasha. Charge: Natasha is accused of adultery after being impregnated twice outside of marriage, first as a young teenager by Yasser, and again later. Despite being a victim of deception and abuse, the court focuses on her pregnancies as evidence of her crime. Trial: the Sharia court holds a public trial where Natasha is brought before religious judges. The evidence against her is her own confession, given under pressure and grief after her mother's murder, and her pregnancies, which under Sharia law are considered proof of adultery. Sentence: the court sentences Natasha to 200 lashes, 100 lashes for each proven act of adultery. The punishment is doubled because she is found guilty of committing the crime twice. Execution of punishment: Natasha is imprisoned until she gives birth to her second child. Shortly after delivering her baby, she is stripped of her upper clothes, tied to a post, and publicly flogged by 2 female executioners. The flogging is so brutal that Natasha loses consciousness after 50 lashes and dies by the 70th lash. Despite her death, the executioners are ordered to continue flogging her body until the full 200 lashes are completed, following the precedent of historical Islamic punishments. Public spectacle: the punishment is carried out in public, near the prison, and broadcast on television for thousands to witness, serving as a warning and a spectacle of justice. Context and impact: the court's punishment is not only physically fatal, but also intended to serve as a public example, reinforcing the social and religious codes that oppress women. The punishment is carried out despite international outcry and appeals from human rights organizations, and despite Natasha's status as a victim of abuse and manipulation. In summary, the Sharia court punishes Natasha with a sentence of 200 lashes for adultery, executed in a public and brutal manner that leads to her death. This punishment is a central moment in the novel, highlighting the cruelty and injustice of the system she is trapped in. The international response to Natasha's punishment by the Sharia court is depicted as one of shock, condemnation, and advocacy. International media and human rights organizations. Widespread media coverage: Natasha's case receives unprecedented attention from international media. News outlets around the world report on her trial, the circumstances of her pregnancies, and the brutal punishment she faces. The story is framed as a symbol of the dangers and injustices of strict religious law, especially as applied to women and minors. Condemnation by human rights groups. Numerous human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and others, publicly condemned the Sudanese Sharia court's decision to sentence Natasha, a minor and a victim of abuse, to 200 lashes for adultery. They argue that she should be treated as a victim, not a criminal. Calls for intervention. International groups and foreign governments call on Sudan to halt the punishment. Some organizations offer to pay large sums of money to commute Natasha's sentence, proposing to redeem her with financial compensation for each lash. But the Sharia court refuses, insisting that divine law cannot be bought or negotiated. Pressure on Sudanese authorities. The case becomes a diplomatic issue, with foreign embassies and international bodies urging Sudan to respect basic human rights and reconsider the application of such harsh punishments, especially against women and children. Public outcry. The story sparks outrage and debate in many countries, fueling discussions about women's rights, religious law, and the need for legal reform in Muslim-majority societies. In summary, the international response is one of strong condemnation, advocacy for Natasha's rights, and calls for reform. Despite these efforts, the Sudanese authorities and Sharia court remain unmoved, and the punishment is carried out, highlighting the limits of international influence in the face of rigid local laws. Gurgis Gabriel, also known as Wahid Muhammad Ahmed, is Natasha's firstborn son, delivered in a Christian orphanage in Khartoum after Natasha's family, facing scandal and danger, decided to give him up at birth. His life in Sudan is marked by profound hardship, social exclusion, and identity crisis. Key aspects of Gurgis's life in Sudan. Orphanage upbringing. Gurgis is raised in a Christian orphanage run by Wahid and Mary Morgas. The orphanage is a rare haven for illegitimate children in a society where adoption is illegal and illegitimacy is deeply stigmatized. Lack of family and identity. He grows up without knowledge of his real parents. The orphanage, following strict rules, does not keep records of biological parents, leaving Gurgis with only vague hints about his origins, such as a possible connection to the prestigious Shurjia tribe. Social stigma and discrimination. As an illegitimate child, Wad Haram, Gurgis faces relentless discrimination from both Muslims and Christians. Among Muslims, he is seen as a disgrace and an outcast. Among Christians, he is treated as a contaminant or a parasite in the Coptic community, which prides itself on purity and exclusivity. Bullying and violence. In public Islamic schools, Gurgis is harassed by teachers and classmates for being a Christian with an Arab name. He is often beaten, ostracized, and forced to leave the classroom during Islamic lessons. Even in Christian schools, he is bullied for his odd background and lack of family. Isolation and anger. The constant rejection and abuse lead Gurgis to feel like an untouchable or outcast, similar to the lowest castes in other societies. He develops deep anger and resentment toward both Muslims and Christians for their cruelty and hypocrisy. Search for belonging. Despite his hardships, Gurgis is intelligent and manages to complete his schooling. However, the pain of not belonging anywhere, neither to the Arab Muslim elite nor to the Coptic Christian community, leaves him with a fractured sense of self. Desire to escape. As he grows older, Gurgis realizes that Sudan will never accept him as an equal. Encouraged by his caretakers, he seeks refugee status abroad, hoping to find a place where he can live with dignity and without the burden of his birth. In summary, Gurgis's life in Sudan is defined by abandonment, relentless social stigma, and a struggle for identity and acceptance. His experiences highlight the cruelty of a society that punishes children for the circumstances of their birth and the urgent need for compassion and reform. Yasser escapes from Sudan by exploiting the chaos and legal loopholes created by his own actions and the social turmoil surrounding Natasha's case. How Yasser escapes from Sudan. Facing arrest and death sentence. After impregnating Natasha twice and being the cause of immense scandal, Yasser is wanted by the Sudanese authorities. The Sharia court sentences him to be stoned to death for adultery, especially since he was married to other women at the time of his crimes. Fleeing after multiple murder attempts. Natasha's relatives attempt to kill Yasser in an honor attack, but he survives. Realizing that both the law and Natasha's family are after him, Yasser understands his life is in imminent danger if he remains in Sudan. Seeking refuge in Egypt. Yasser flees Sudan with his third wife, Maria, who is a Christian from South Sudan. They travel to Egypt, where they apply for refugee status. Yasser supports his application with medical reports from his injuries and police complaints about the murder attempts against him, claiming he is a victim of honor violence. Gaining refugee status. The United Nations office in Cairo grants Yasser and Maria refugee status, recognizing the danger he faces if returned to Sudan. This status allows them to seek resettlement in a Western country. Resettlement in Canada. Due to the urgency of his case and the risk of extradition to Sudan, where he would face execution. The UN office and the Canadian embassy expedite his resettlement. Yasser and Maria are flown to Canada within 6 days of their application being prioritized. Manipulating the system. Throughout this process, Yasser lies about his marital status and downplays or distorts his criminal actions, presenting himself as a persecuted individual rather than a perpetrator. In summary, Yasser escapes from Sudan by fleeing to Egypt, obtaining refugee status through the UN, and being resettled in Canada with the help of international agencies. He avoids both legal punishment and retribution from Natasha's family by manipulating the refugee system and presenting himself as a victim rather than an abuser. After Yasser and Maria arrive in Canada as refugees, Maria's life becomes increasingly difficult and marked by hardship and disappointment. Maria's life after arriving in Canada. Initial resettlement. Maria and Yasser are received by Canadian immigration officials and temporarily housed in a guest house for new refugees. Maria speaks Arabic and her native Dinka language, but has little to no English proficiency, which makes integration challenging. Marital strife and instability. Maria soon discovers that Yasser has a history of manipulation and polygamy. She becomes entangled in conflicts with Yasser's other wives, particularly Duria, leading to public altercations and police involvement. Yasser's relationships with his wives are unstable, and he ultimately abandons both Maria and Duria, seeking new opportunities and relationships. Financial and social hardship. Maria struggles financially. She is forced to work menial jobs, including as a maidservant, and faces the risk of exploitation and abuse. Yasser, meanwhile, is often unemployed and relies on Maria's income and government assistance. Isolation and discrimination. As a southern Sudanese Christian woman in Canada, Maria faces both racial and cultural discrimination. She is marginalized within both the Sudanese immigrant community and the broader society. Single motherhood. After Yasser is imprisoned for sexual offenses and child abuse, Maria is left to raise their daughter, Susan, alone. She works night shifts in a factory to support herself and her child, sending her daughter to a cousin for babysitting during her shifts. Continued hardship. Maria's life remains difficult. She is abandoned by Yasser, who cycles between his wives for material gain, and she receives little to no support from him. Eventually, Maria files for divorce on the grounds of marital infidelity and is granted a divorce certificate. Seeking stability. After her divorce, Maria tries to rebuild her life as a single mother in Canada, focusing on providing for her daughter and seeking some measure of stability and dignity after years of exploitation and abuse. In summary, Maria's life in Canada is marked by struggle, exploitation, and resilience. She faces abandonment by Yasser, financial hardship, and the challenges of single motherhood, but ultimately seeks to create a better life for herself and her daughter despite the odds. Yasser's pattern of deception toward Natasha, Badria, Duria, and Maria is central to his character and the unfolding tragedy. Here's how he deceives each woman. Natasha. Emotional manipulation. Yasser, as Natasha's older neighbor, manipulates her emotionally when she is only 14. He convinces her that he loves her and persuades her into a secret sexual relationship, promising marriage as a way to legitimize their union. False promises. He assures Natasha that he will marry her, even though he is already married and knows her family would never approve. He exploits her naivety and lack of knowledge about Islamic law. Abandonment. After impregnating Natasha, Yasser flees when her family and community seek retribution, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Repeated deception. When they cross paths again, Yasser rekindles the relationship, again hiding the truth about his marital status and intentions, leading to a second pregnancy and further trauma for Natasha. Badria. Arranged marriage and neglect. Badria is Yasser's first wife, married through family arrangement. Yasser never forms an emotional bond with her and is unfaithful from the start. Polygamy without consent. He marries other women without her consent, using religious justification for polygamy, and neglects Badriya emotionally and materially. Manipulation and threats. When Badriya protests his infidelity, Yasser threatens her with divorce and the loss of her children, using fear to keep her compliant. Dariya. Exploitation for gain. Dariya, a teacher, becomes Yasser's second wife. He is attracted to her financial stability and manipulates her into marriage, despite being already married. Financial and emotional abuse. Yasser relies on Dariya's income, and when she is imprisoned for a financial offense, he abandons her, bringing Badriya back to care for his children. Betrayal. While Dariya is in prison, Yasser starts a relationship with her best friend Maria, showing no loyalty or remorse. Maria. False love and hidden motives. Maria, a Christian teacher, is Yasser's third wife. He pursues her for her job and income, promising love and marriage but hiding his true motives. Religious manipulation. Yasser agrees to Maria's condition of not converting to Islam, but only because it is convenient for him, not out of respect for her faith. Abandonment and exploitation. When Maria becomes pregnant and faces hardship, Yasser abandons her for other wives or new opportunities, only returning when it benefits him financially or socially. In summary, Yasser deceives all four women through a combination of emotional manipulation, false promises, religious and cultural justifications, and outright lies. He exploits their trust, abandons them in times of need, and uses them for personal gain, leaving a trail of trauma and broken lives. His actions are never motivated by genuine love or remorse, but by self-interest and a desire to escape accountability. Natasha's reaction to Yasser's betrayal is one of profound trauma, anger, and ultimately, a courageous determination to reclaim her dignity and seek justice. Natasha's reactions to Yasser's betrayal. 1. Shock and trauma. Natasha is initially deceived by Yasser, who manipulates her into a relationship as a young teenager. When she realizes she has been used and abandoned, she is devastated. The betrayal is compounded by the social stigma, threats of violence, and the loss of her childhood innocence. 2. Enduring social stigma and isolation. Yasser's actions lead to Natasha's ostracism and repeated cycles of harassment, forced migration, and loss of educational opportunities. She suffers not only physically and emotionally, but also bears the brunt of her community's judgment, while Yasser escapes accountability. 3. Grief and guilt. After her mother is murdered in an honor attack meant for her, Natasha is overwhelmed with guilt, blaming herself for the tragedy that has befallen her family as a result of Yasser's betrayal. 4. Anger and resolve. Natasha's pain transforms into anger and a desire for justice. She decides to expose Yasser, confessing the truth to the authorities about who impregnated her, even though it puts her at further risk. She refuses to remain silent or protect her abuser any longer. 5. Courage and defiance. Despite the threat of brutal punishment by the Sharia court, Natasha stands by her confession and refuses to recant. She faces her fate with dignity, determined to tell her story and hold Yasser accountable, even as she is sentenced to a fatal flogging. 6. Lasting psychological impact. The cumulative effect of Yasser's betrayal, the violence she endures, and the loss of her family leave Natasha deeply scarred. She struggles with trauma, guilt, and, at times, a crisis of faith and identity. Yet, she also channels her suffering into a quest for understanding, education, and advocacy for women's rights. 7. Legacy of resilience. Natasha's journey, though marked by suffering, is also defined by her resilience. She survives, tells her story, and ultimately becomes a symbol of resistance against the systems and individuals that betrayed her. In summary, Natasha's reaction to Yasser's betrayal is a complex mix of pain, anger, and courageous defiance. She refuses to be silenced or destroyed by what happened to her, and her determination to speak out and seek justice becomes a central force in the novel. Natasha's pursuit of justice is marked by both extraordinary courage and tragic consequences. Here's how Natasha seeks justice after Yasser's betrayal and abuse. 1. Breaking her silence. After enduring manipulation, abuse, and abandonment by Yasser, Natasha initially tries to protect him out of fear and shame. However, following the brutal murder of her mother, who died shielding Natasha from an honor killing, Natasha's grief and anger push her to break her silence. She confesses to the authorities that Yasser is the man who impregnated her, contradicting her earlier, coerced story that masked the truth. 2. Testifying to the authorities. Natasha bravely provides a full confession to the police, admitting that Yasser deceived and abused her, and that he was responsible for both her pregnancies. She also reveals that her earlier claim of being raped by masked classmates was fabricated to protect Yasser. This act of truth-telling is a direct challenge to the culture of silence and victim-blaming that surrounds her. 3. Facing the Sharia court. Despite knowing the risks, Natasha stands by her confession in the Sharia court, refusing to recant or shift blame. She hopes that by telling the truth, the authorities will pursue Yasser and bring him to justice for his crimes against her. 4. Enduring public punishment. Natasha's pursuit of justice comes at a great personal cost. Instead of being treated as a victim, she is prosecuted for adultery and sentenced to 200 lashes, a punishment that ultimately leads to her death. Her willingness to speak out, even in the face of fatal consequences, is portrayed as an act of moral courage and a demand for justice, not just for herself, but for all women trapped in similar circumstances. 5. Inspiring international outcry. Natasha's case draws the attention of international media and human rights organizations, who condemn the injustice she faces and advocate for her release. Although these efforts cannot save her, they amplify her voice and turn her story into a symbol of resistance against oppressive systems. In summary, Natasha seeks justice by courageously telling the truth about her abuse, confronting her abuser through legal channels, and refusing to be silenced, even when the cost is her own life. Her actions expose the failures of the legal and social systems meant to protect her, and her story becomes a rallying point for calls to reform and justice for women in similar situations. Yasser's deception of Brittany Johnson, Brittany, in Canada is a disturbing example of manipulation and exploitation. How Yasser deceives Brittany Johnson. 1. Targeting vulnerability. Brittany is a 14-year-old runaway with a history of abuse, neglect, and street life. Yasser meets her through mutual acquaintances in Calgary, recognizing her vulnerability and lack of support. 2. Gaining her trust. Yasser presents himself as someone who cares for Brittany, providing her with money, attention, and a sense of belonging she has never experienced. He exploits her need for affection and stability, making her dependent on him for emotional and material support. 3. Supplying addictions. He enables Brittany's addictions to alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs, further deepening her dependence on him and making it easier to manipulate her decisions and behavior. 4. Sexual exploitation. Yasser initiates a sexual relationship with Brittany, often taking advantage of her when she is drunk or under the influence of drugs. He deliberately has unprotected sex with her, knowing she is too impaired to consent or resist. 5. Manipulating with false promises. Yasser tells Brittany he is willing to leave his wife and marry her, even proposing to take her to the Middle East where, he claims, she could legally marry at her age. He forges a marriage certificate in Arabic and tricks her into signing it, pretending it is a work permit or travel document. 6. Isolating her. He encourages Brittany to rely on him and discourages her from seeking help from her family or authorities, making her feel that he is her only option for safety and care. 7. Abandoning responsibility. When Brittany becomes pregnant, Yasser does not support her. Instead, he waits for her to beg him to marry her, believing that her pregnancy will force her into further dependence on him. 8. Legal consequences. Yasser's actions eventually lead to his arrest for kidnapping, rape, providing drugs and alcohol to a minor, and other serious charges. Brittany is treated as a victim by the authorities and placed in foster care, while Yasser is prosecuted and imprisoned. In summary, Yasser deceives Brittany Johnson by exploiting her vulnerability, manipulating her emotionally and materially, and using false promises and forged documents to control her. His actions are predatory and calculated, resulting in severe harm to Brittany and ultimately leading to his own criminal conviction. If you'd like more detail about Brittany's experience or the aftermath, let me know. Yasser faced a series of serious criminal charges in Canada after his exploitation and abuse of Brittany Johnson, Brittany, a 14-year-old girl. The charges included criminal charges against Yasser. Kidnapping. Yasser was charged with unlawfully confining and controlling Brittany, a minor, and preventing her from seeking help or leaving the situation. Rape. Sexual assault of a minor. He was charged with raping Brittany Johnson, who was underage, including having sex with her while she was drunk and drugged, and impregnating her. Imprisonment of a minor. Yasser was accused of imprisoning Brittany, keeping her in his apartment and controlling her movements. Impregnating a minor. He was charged with impregnating a 14-year-old girl, which is a serious criminal offense. Providing alcohol, tobacco, and drugs to a minor. Yasser supplied Brittany with alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs, further deepening her dependence and vulnerability. Forgery and fraudulent marriage certificate. He forged an Islamic marriage certificate in Arabic and tricked Brittany into signing it, pretending it was a work permit or travel document. Planning to smuggle a minor out of Canada. Yasser planned to take Brittany out of Canada to the Middle East, where he claimed he could marry her legally despite her age. Legal outcome. Yasser was found guilty on all these charges by a Canadian criminal court. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment and was to be deported to his country of origin after serving his sentence. However, the court later retracted the deportation order when it was determined he would face execution in Sudan. In summary, Yasser faced charges of kidnapping, rape, unlawful imprisonment, impregnating a minor, supplying a minor with alcohol and drugs, forgery, and planning to smuggle a minor out of the country. These charges reflected the full extent of his predatory and criminal behavior in Canada. Here's a comparative analysis of the trial of Brittany in Canada and the trial of Natasha in Sudan as depicted in the novel Natasha and Her Illegitimate Child in a Muslim Society by Dr. A. Ahmed. 1. Legal context and setting. Brittany's trial in Canada. Location: Calgary, Canada. Legal system: Canadian secular law, based on Western legal principles, human rights, and child protection. Nature of crime: Brittany, a 14-year-old white Canadian girl, is impregnated by Yasser, a much older Sudanese immigrant. Yasser is charged with kidnapping, rape, providing alcohol and drugs to a minor, and planning to smuggle her out of the country. Focus: the trial centers on the protection of minors, consent, and the criminal responsibility of adults who exploit children. Natasha's trial in Sudan. Location: Khartoum, Sudan. Legal system: Islamic Sharia law, with strict religious and cultural codes regarding sexuality, honor, and family. Nature of crime: Natasha, a Muslim girl, is impregnated twice out of wedlock by Yasser. She is charged with adultery, zina, and illegal pregnancy. Focus: the trial is about enforcing religious morality, family honor, and punishing sexual transgressions, especially by women. 2. Treatment of the victim. Brittany. Status: treated as a victim of statutory rape and exploitation. Legal protection: the law recognizes her as a minor incapable of consent. She is placed in foster care, given the option for abortion, and receives psychological and social support. Societal response: the focus is on her rehabilitation and protection. The perpetrator, Yasser, is the one prosecuted and punished. Natasha. Status: treated as a criminal and source of shame. Legal protection: none. Despite being a minor and a victim of manipulation and statutory rape, she is prosecuted for adultery and illegal pregnancy. Societal response. Natasha is stigmatized, threatened with honor killing, and ultimately sentenced to 200 lashes. Her suffering is compounded by family and community pressure. 3. Nature of the trial and punishment. Brittany. Trial. Conducted in a secular court with due process, legal representation, and media scrutiny. Punishment. Yasser is sentenced to 15 years in prison and faces deportation. The law is clear that adults are responsible for not exploiting minors. Outcome. The system aims to protect the child and punish the abuser. Natasha. Trial. Conducted in a Sharia court, public, with religious judges. No legal representation for Natasha. Confessions and pregnancy are used as evidence. Punishment. Natasha is sentenced to 200 lashes, double punishment for 2 pregnancies. The punishment is delayed until after childbirth, then carried out publicly, resulting in her death. Outcome. The system punishes the victim, upholds family honor, and enforces religious codes. 4. Societal and gender dynamics. Brittany. Gender dynamics. The law is gender-neutral in principle, but especially protective of minors and women in cases of sexual exploitation. Societal attitude. There is outrage against the perpetrator and sympathy for the victim. Natasha. Gender dynamics. The law is heavily patriarchal. Women bear the burden of family honor and are punished for sexual transgressions, even when victimized. Societal attitude. The community is more concerned with honor and reputation than Natasha's well-being. Her family is pressured to kill her or punish her severely. 5. Broader implications. Brittany's case. Highlights. The importance of child protection, the dangers of cultural misunderstandings, and the challenges of integrating immigrants with different legal and moral codes. Critique. The novel critiques how some immigrants may misunderstand or exploit Western freedoms, but the legal system remains focused on individual rights and child safety. Natasha's case. Highlights. The dangers of honor culture, the brutality of Sharia punishments for women, and the lack of agency for female victims. Critique. The novel is a strong indictment of religious legal systems that prioritize honor and control over women's bodies above justice or compassion. Summary table. Aspect Brittany, Canada, Natasha, Sudan. Legal system secular, rights-based Sharia, honor/religion-based. Victim status protected, rehabilitated criminalized, punished. Perpetrator prosecuted, imprisoned initially escapes, later prosecuted. Trial due process, legal defense religious court, public no defense. Punishment perpetrator imprisoned victim flogged to death. Societal attitude sympathy for victim stigma, pressure for honor killing. Gender dynamics protective of minors, gender neutral laws patriarchal, women bear honor burden. Conclusion. The novel uses these 2 trials to starkly contrast the outcomes for young women in different legal and cultural systems. Brittany's case demonstrates the protective, rights-based approach of Western law, while Natasha's case exposes the dangers and injustices of a system where honor, religion, and patriarchy override compassion and justice for victims.